In a quiet suburban neighborhood where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine with perfectly trimmed lawns and shiny cars parked in driveways, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass on most days, and kids played basketball in cul-de-sacs while parents chatted over fences. It was the kind of place people moved to escape the chaos of city life. A little slice of peace. One of the newer residents was a man who had recently bought a cozy home near the end of the street. He wasn't flashy or loud. Instead, he kept to himself, taking care of his property and going about his day with quiet dignity. What many didn't know right away was that this man had served his country for years, wearing a uniform and putting his life on the line so others could live freely. Now retired, he wanted nothing more than to enjoy the simple pleasures of civilian life: gardening, reading books under the shade of a tree, and maybe getting to know his neighbors better. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared his vision of harmony. Across the street lived a woman who fancied herself the unofficial queen of the area. She spent her days patrolling the streets in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes about things she deemed unacceptable. A mailbox painted the wrong color? Noted. Someone's trash can left out overnight? Definitely noted. Her sharp tongue and constant complaints earned her the nickname HOA Karen. Though no one dared say it to her face, this woman had a teenage son who followed in her footsteps, at least when it came to making trouble. He was the type of kid who thought rules applied only to other people. With a loud truck plastered with stickers that raised eyebrows and a habit of mouthing off to anyone who crossed him, he made quite the impression around the block. To his mom, he was perfect. To everyone else, he was just another headache they wished would go away. One sunny Saturday afternoon, the retired veteran decided to wash his car. It was a routine task, something he enjoyed doing because it gave him time to think and relax. As he scrubbed away dirt and rinsed off soap suds, he noticed someone approaching from across the street. It was the neighbor's son, walking with an exaggerated swagger that screamed teenage arrogance. The boy stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, glaring like he owned the place. Without so much as a hello, he demanded, "Hey, you, do you even live here? Show me some ID." The request caught the man off guard. He straightened up, wiping water droplets from his hands onto his jeans. "Excuse me?" he replied, his voice calm but firm. "You heard me," the teenager shot back. "Prove you belong here." For a moment, the man simply stared at him, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't a security guard or a police officer asking for identification. It was a random teenager acting like he had authority. The absurdity of the situation struck him, and he couldn't help but chuckle softly. "I don't have to show you anything," he said evenly. "I'm minding my own business, same as anyone else." That answer clearly wasn't what the boy expected. His face turned red, either from embarrassment or anger. It was hard to tell. "You're causing problems," he snapped. "My mom says people like you ruin neighborhoods. People like me?" The man echoed, raising an eyebrow. There was no mistaking the implication behind those words. Still, he refused to let the comment rattle him. Instead, he leaned against his car, crossing his arms. "Tell your mom I said hi," he replied dryly. "And next time, try being polite before you start accusing people of things." The boy sputtered something unintelligible before storming off, muttering under his breath. The encounter left the man shaking his head. He finished washing his car, thinking it was just another odd moment in a world full of them. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Across the street, the boy stomped into the house, slamming doors and ranting to his mother about how disrespectful the new neighbor had been. She listened intently, nodding along as her son vented. By the time he was done, her jaw was set in a hard line. No one treated her family like that, not in her neighborhood. She marched outside, determination etched into every step. Her mind raced with plans, each more dramatic than the last. If the man wouldn't listen to reason, then she'd make sure he regretted ever setting foot in their community. After all, she had connections. People listened to her. And if there was one thing she excelled at, it was making sure everyone knew exactly who was in charge. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, neither the man nor the woman realized how much this single confrontation would change everything for both of them and the entire neighborhood. The man didn't think much of the earlier confrontation as he finished washing his car. He figured it was just one of those weird moments that happen when you move into a new neighborhood, people sizing each other up, testing boundaries. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the teenager's attitude had been off. It wasn't just rudeness. There was an edge to it, a sense of entitlement that felt almost rehearsed, like he'd been coached on how to act. Still, he shrugged it off and went inside to dry off and relax. He made himself a cup of coffee, turned on some soft music, and settled into his favorite chair by the window. The evening light filtered through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the room. For a while, everything seemed calm again. That is, until he heard the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside. Curious, he peeked out the window. Across the street, the boy's mother was pacing back and forth in her driveway, talking animatedly on her phone. Her face was red, and she gestured wildly with her hands, pointing toward his house every few seconds. Something about the intensity of her movement set off alarm bells in his mind. Whatever she was saying, it didn't look good, before he could dwell on it too much. Another noise caught his attention, the unmistakable wail of police sirens growing louder as they approached. His stomach dropped. Sure enough, 2 patrol cars rolled down the street and came to a stop right in front of his house. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, curiosity getting the better of them. Some stood on their porches, others leaned over fences, craning their necks to see what all the commotion was about. The man stepped outside, his heart pounding but his expression calm. He didn't want to seem defensive or guilty, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. As he walked toward the officers, he noticed the crowd gathering around. A few people whispered among themselves, casting curious glances his way. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the 2 uniformed figures stepping out of their cruisers. One of the officers, a tall man with a kind face and graying temples, approached him first. "Are you the homeowner here?" the officer asked, his tone neutral but respectful. "Yes, I am," the man replied, standing straighter. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "Is there a problem?" The officer studied him for a moment before responding. "We received a call about a disturbance involving you and one of your neighbors. Can we talk for a minute?" The man nodded, gesturing toward his driveway. "Of course. Let's step aside." As they moved away from the growing audience, the second officer hung back, keeping an eye on the crowd. The veteran couldn't help but notice how tense everyone seemed. It was like watching a scene unfold in slow motion. He knew this was going to get messy, but he also knew he had to stay composed. Once they were out of earshot, the officer spoke again. "Mind telling me what happened?" Without hesitation, the man recounted the events of the afternoon. He explained how the neighbor's son had confronted him for no apparent reason, demanding ID and making accusations that didn't make sense. He described the boy's aggressive demeanor and the subsequent visit from the boy's mother, who had clearly been upset. Throughout the explanation, the officer listened intently, nodding occasionally. When the man finished, the officer let out a low whistle. "That sounds complicated," he said carefully. Then, after a pause, he added, "Thank you for your service, by the way." The man blinked, surprised. How did you know? Your posture, your composure. The officer interrupted with a small smile. It's not hard to spot someone with military training. Plus, we ran your info before coming here. You've got quite the record. For a brief moment, the tension eased. The man felt a flicker of pride at the recognition, but it was quickly overshadowed by the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a decorated veteran, being questioned because a teenager decided to play cop in his own driveway. The officer continued, "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't the first time we've dealt with situations like this in neighborhoods like yours. Sometimes people get carried away thinking they're enforcing rules that don't actually exist." The man chuckled dryly. "Yeah, I got that impression pretty quickly." Just then, the boy's mother appeared, storming across the street like a hurricane. She marched up to the group, her face flushed and her voice shrill. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man is completely out of control. He refused to show ID to my son and disrespected us both." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. One of them turned to her and held up a hand. "Ma'am, please, we're handling this." But she wasn't about to back down. Handling it? What's there to handle? He's clearly causing trouble. Why else would he refuse to cooperate? The veteran crossed his arms, leaning slightly forward. "Because I don't owe your son or anyone else an explanation for existing in my own driveway," he said, his voice steady but firm. "If I broke a law, fine. Arrest me. But don't expect me to entertain baseless demands." The woman bristled, opening her mouth to argue further, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, demanding identification without probable cause isn't legal. Your son doesn't have the authority to ask for ID unless he's a law enforcement official. And frankly, based on what we've heard so far, it sounds like this whole thing was unnecessary." Her jaw dropped. For a split second, she looked like she might explode, but then she recovered, her voice dripping with venom. "Oh, I see how it is. You're taking his side because he's—" She trailed off, waving a hand dismissively at him. The implication hung heavy in the air. The officer stiffened, his tone turning icy. "Let's be clear. We aren't taking anyone's side. We're here to enforce the law, not personal vendettas. If you continue harassing your neighbors, we'll have no choice but to investigate further. Is that understood?" She sputtered, unable to form a coherent response. Behind her, the teenage boy lingered near the curb, looking both smug and nervous. Clearly, he hadn't expected things to escalate this far. Meanwhile, the neighbors who had gathered began whispering amongst themselves. Some shot sympathetic glances at the veteran, while others openly stared at the woman, shaking their heads. It was clear whose side most of them were on. After a few more minutes of awkward tension, the officers wrapped up their conversation with the man. They assured him they'd document the incident and keep an eye on the situation moving forward. As they prepared to leave, the graying officer gave him a firm handshake. "Stay safe," he said quietly. "And thanks again for everything." As the patrol cars drove away, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind a mix of murmurs and lingering stares. The veteran sighed, running a hand over his face. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, at least, he could breathe a little easier. Back across the street, the woman fumed, pacing her driveway like a caged animal. Her son hovered nearby, avoiding eye contact. Neither of them spoke, but the anger radiating off her was palpable. It was obvious she wasn't used to being told she was wrong, and she certainly wasn't ready to admit defeat. Little did any of them realize, this incident was about to ripple through the neighborhood in ways none of them could have predicted. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to an unusual buzz. Word of the previous day's drama had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Neighbors who hadn't even been outside during the police visit were now talking about it over coffee, in group chats, and even at the local grocery store. The story had taken on a life of its own, with each retelling adding new layers, some exaggerated, others softened, but the core message remained the same. Something big had happened, and it involved the retired veteran and the HOA Karen. The sun rose higher in the sky. The man stepped out onto his porch to fetch the newspaper. He wasn't surprised to find a small crowd gathered near his mailbox. At first, he thought maybe someone was having car trouble or needed help with something. But as he approached, he realized they weren't there for assistance. They were there for him. One by one, neighbors introduced themselves, some sheepishly, others more confidently. A middle-aged woman held out a plate of cookies wrapped in plastic wrap. "We just wanted to say welcome," she said with a warm smile, "and thank you for standing your ground yesterday. It takes guts to handle that kind of nonsense without losing your cool." Another neighbor, a younger guy with a toddler perched on his shoulders, chimed in. "Yeah, man. We've all seen how she is, the clipboard, the complaints, the constant nitpicking. Honestly, we're glad someone finally called her out." The man stood there, momentarily overwhelmed. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. Sure, he'd hoped people would understand where he was coming from, but he never imagined they'd rally around him so openly. He accepted the cookies with a nod of gratitude, feeling a strange mix of pride and humility wash over him. Word continued to spread throughout the day. By evening, notes started appearing on his doorstep and mailbox. Some were short and sweet, "Welcome to the neighborhood." Others were longer, sharing personal stories of run-ins with the same neighbor. One note, written in neat cursive, read, "Thank you for reminding us what real strength looks like. You're not alone here, we've got your back." It was clear that the incident had struck a nerve. For years, many residents had quietly tolerated the woman's behavior, brushing it off as harmless or too much effort to confront. But seeing someone stand up to her, not with aggression, but with calm dignity, had inspired them to rethink their silence. Slowly but surely, cracks began to form in her reign over the neighborhood. Meanwhile, across the street, the woman sat, fuming in her living room. She couldn't believe how things had turned against her so quickly. In her mind, she had been the victim, a concerned homeowner trying to protect her community from outsiders who didn't belong. But instead of being praised for her vigilance, she was being ridiculed. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls from friends, or so-called friends, most of whom seemed more interested in gossip than offering support. Her son, sensing the storm brewing, kept a low profile. Gone was the swagger and bravado he'd shown the day before. Instead, he moped around the house, avoiding eye contact and spending hours glued to his phone. His truck, once a symbol of teenage rebellion, disappeared from the driveway altogether. Rumor had it he'd parked it behind a friend's house, too embarrassed to drive it around anymore. The tension reached its peak when the Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs, filled with discussions about landscaping rules and holiday decorations. This time, however, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Chairs were set up in the community center, and nearly every resident showed up, eager to weigh in on the controversy. When the meeting began, the usual formalities felt rushed. The current HOA president, none other than the woman herself, tried to steer the conversation toward mundane topics, but the crowd wasn't having it. One by one, people stood up to voice their concerns, many of them directly addressing the events of the past few days. An older man with a thick mustache spoke first. "I've lived here for 20 years, and I've watched this neighborhood change. But one thing hasn't changed. The way some folks treat others like they don't belong. That's not okay. Not anymore." A young mother followed, clutching her baby in her arms. "My kids play outside every day. They deserve to grow up in a place where everyone feels welcome, not judged because of the color of their skin or where they come from." Each speaker added fuel to the fire, their words painting a picture of frustration and long-suppressed resentment. When it was the veteran's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He stood slowly, taking a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "I didn't move here looking for trouble," he began, his voice steady but heartfelt. "All I wanted was a peaceful place to call home. What happened yesterday wasn't about me, it was about respect. Respect for each other, for our differences, and for the fact that we're all part of this community. If we let fear or prejudice divide us, then we lose sight of what makes neighborhoods like this special." His words resonated deeply. As he sat down, applause broke out, echoing through the room. Even those who had initially sided with the woman found themselves nodding along, unable to deny the truth in what he said. By the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. The woman would step down as HOA president. It wasn't done out of spite or vengeance. It was a collective acknowledgement that leadership should reflect the values of inclusivity and unity, not division and control. The role was handed over to a soft-spoken retiree who promised to focus on bringing people together rather than tearing them apart. For the woman, the loss of power was devastating. She retreated into her home, rarely venturing outside except to tend to her garden. Her son followed suit, trading his loud truck for a beat-up bicycle that he rode only when absolutely necessary. Their presence in the neighborhood became a shadow of what at once was a stark contrast to the newfound energy radiating from everyone else. As for the veteran, he found himself surrounded by neighbors who genuinely cared. People invited him to barbecues, asked for advice on gardening, and even offered to help with minor repairs around his house. Slowly but surely, the walls of isolation that had existed between households began to crumble, replaced by genuine connections and shared experiences. What had started as a confrontation, rooted in ignorance and prejudice, had transformed into an opportunity for growth, not just for individuals, but for the entire community. And while the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, the seeds of change had been planted. All it took was one person choosing to stand firm, to lead with grace, and to remind everyone that strength lies not in domination, but in understanding. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to feel different. The air carried a lighter energy, as if a weight had been lifted. People who once kept to themselves started chatting more freely over fences and during evening walks. Kids played together in the cul-de-sac without hesitation, their laughter echoing through the streets. It was subtle at first, a wave here, a smile there, but soon it became clear that something fundamental had shifted. The retired veteran noticed the change immediately. Neighbors who had previously only nodded politely now stopped by unannounced, with plates of cookies or offers to help mow his lawn. One Saturday morning, he found a group of them gathered in his driveway, tools in hand, ready to tackle some minor repairs around his house. "We figured you might need an extra pair of hands," one of them joked. Though there was sincerity behind the words, he couldn't help but smile as he joined them, working side by side under the warm sun. There was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before, an unspoken understanding that they were all in this together. Conversations flowed easily, ranging from stories about family vacations to debates over the best type of mulch for flower beds. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he truly belonged. Across the street, however, things remained eerily quiet. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with her clipboard now stayed hidden behind closed curtains. Her garden, once immaculate, began to show signs of neglect: overgrown bushes, weeds creeping into the flower beds, and leaves piling up along the edges of her driveway. She rarely ventured outside except late at night when most people were asleep. Even then, she moved quickly, head down, avoiding eye contact. Her son mirrored her behavior. Gone was the swaggering teenager who used to rev his truck engine just to annoy the neighbors. Now he stuck to his bicycle, pedaling silently past houses as if hoping no one would notice him. Occasionally, someone would try to strike up a conversation, but he'd mutter something vague and hurry away, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Despite their withdrawal, the rest of the neighborhood didn't dwell on it. Instead, they focused on building connections and fostering a sense of community. Inspired by the veterans' calm demeanor and leadership during the HOA meeting, several residents organized events aimed at bringing everyone closer together. First came a block party, held on a crisp autumn afternoon. Tables lined the street, laden with homemade dishes ranging from lasagna to apple pie. Kids darted between games set up in driveways while adults laughed and swapped stories. The veteran stood near the grill, flipping burgers and sharing tales from his time in service. His stories captivated listeners, drawing both admiration and respect. At one point, a young boy tugged on his sleeve and asked, "Were you ever scared?" The question caught him off guard, but he knelt down to meet the child's curious gaze. "Of course I was," he admitted with a grin. But sometimes, being brave isn't about not feeling afraid, it's about doing what's right even when you are. The boy nodded thoughtfully, as if committing those words to memory, while the adults nearby exchanged knowing glances. Moments like these reminded everyone why they had rallied behind him in the first place, not because he sought attention, but because he embodied the values they wanted to see reflected in their community. As the weeks went on, more initiatives followed. A charity drive collected clothes and canned goods for local shelters, with nearly every household contributing something. Another event honored veterans, complete with speeches, flags fluttering in the breeze, and a moment of silence for those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. During the ceremony, the man stood quietly beside the podium, visibly moved as neighbors thanked him for his service and praised his role in sparking positive change. Even the officers who had responded to the initial call became regular visitors. They weren't there to enforce laws or mediate disputes. Instead, they stopped by to chat, share updates about town happenings, or lend a hand with yard work. Their presence reinforced the idea that law enforcement wasn't just about authority, it was also about connection and trust. Amidst all this progress, whispers occasionally surfaced about the woman and her son. Some speculated they might move away, unable to face the fallout from their actions. Others hoped they'd eventually come around, recognizing the error of their ways and rejoining the community. But for now, the consensus was simple. Life had moved on without them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, the veteran sat on his porch sipping coffee. Across the way, he could see faint lights flickering through the curtains of the woman's house. He wondered what she must be thinking, holed up inside day after day. Was she angry, regretful, lonely? He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. Whatever her feelings, they weren't his responsibility anymore. What mattered was how the rest of the neighborhood had responded, not with anger or revenge, but with compassion and unity. By choosing to rise above the negativity, they had created something stronger than any rulebook or clipboard could dictate. A real sense of belonging. As he leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a dog, he allowed himself a small smile. This place, once unfamiliar and daunting, now felt like home. And for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful not just for himself, but for the future of the community he was proud to call his own. Little did anyone realize the ripple Effects of that single confrontation would continue to shape the neighborhood for years to come. Bonds forged in moments of adversity tend to last, and the lessons learned from standing up for what's right often inspire others to do the same. In time, the story of the veteran and the HOA Karen would become part of local lore. Reminder that even in the face of ignorance and prejudice, courage and kindness can pave the way for lasting change. Months had passed since the incident that turned the neighborhood upside down, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The tension that once lingered in the air was gone, replaced by a sense of ease and belonging. People no longer tiptoed around difficult conversations. They embraced them, knowing that honesty and understanding could bridge even the widest gaps. The retired veteran had become a cornerstone of the community, not because he sought the spotlight, but because his actions spoke louder than words. Neighbors trusted him, looked up to him, and often turned to him for advice or guidance. Whether it was helping an elderly couple carry groceries inside or mediating a disagreement over parking spaces, he approached every situation with patience and fairness. His presence reminded everyone that leadership isn't about power, it's about service. One crisp winter morning, as frost clung to the grass and chimneys puffed out lazy trails of smoke, the neighborhood came together for its annual holiday gathering. Strings of lights twinkled along rooftops, wreaths hung proudly on doors, and the scent of pine mingled with the aroma of hot cocoa wafting from kitchens. The event was held in the community center, transformed into a cozy haven with blankets. Draped over chairs and candles flickering softly in glass jars as families filed in, laughter filled the room. Kids darted between tables loaded with treats, while adults exchanged hugs and updates about their lives. At the center of it all stood the veteran, surrounded by neighbors eager to thank him again, not just for standing up to the HOA Karen, but for everything he'd done since then. "You've changed this place," one woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Before you got here, we were kind of stuck. We let things slide because it seemed easier. But you showed us that doing the right thing is worth the effort." He chuckled softly, brushing off the praise with a modest shrug. "I didn't do anything special," he replied. "All I did was refuse to back down when someone tried to make me feel like I didn't belong. That's not courage, that's just common sense." But the crowd wasn't convinced. They knew better. What they saw in him wasn't just resilience. It was grace under pressure, a quiet strength that inspired others to follow suit. And so, amidst cheers and applause, they presented him with a small plaque engraved with a simple message, asterisk, "For your bravery and leadership, you've made our community stronger." Asterisk. It was a gesture that left him speechless. As he accepted the plaque, his eyes scanned the room, taking in the smiling faces of his neighbors. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed not by pride, but by gratitude. These people, who had once been strangers, had welcomed him into their lives in ways he never expected. Their support reminded him that communities aren't built on shared hobbies or similar backgrounds. They're built on mutual respect and a willingness to stand together, even when it's hard. Across the street, the woman watched the festivities from behind her curtains. She hadn't attended any neighborhood events since stepping down as HOA president, choosing instead to isolate herself and her son from the world outside. Her garden remained unkempt, her mailbox overflowing with flyers she never bothered to read. Yet, despite her efforts to shut everyone out, curiosity tugged at her. She couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to step back into the fold, to rebuild the relationship she had burned. Her son, too, felt the weight of their isolation. Once popular among his peers, he now spent most of his time alone. In his room, scrolling through social media or playing video games. Occasionally, he'd glance out the window and see groups of kids riding bikes or building snowmen in the cul-de-sac. He missed those days, the carefree laughter, the camaraderie, but he didn't know how to reclaim them. Every time he considered reaching out, fear held him back. What if they rejected him? What if they laughed? One evening, as snow blanketed the ground in a soft white embrace, there was a knock at their door. Startled, the woman hesitated before opening it. On the other side stood a teenage girl holding a plate of cookies. Behind her, several other neighbors waited, bundled up against the cold. "We brought you some treats," the girl said brightly, extending the plate, "and we wanted to check in. How are you guys doing?" The woman froze, unsure how to respond. For weeks, she'd assumed everyone hated her, that they whispered cruel things behind her back. But here they were, smiling warmly, offering friendship instead of judgment. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stammered a quiet, "Thank you." That visit marked the beginning of a slow but steady thaw. Over time, she started venturing outside again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She joined a book club hosted by one of her former critics, discovering a shared love of mystery novels. Her son, encouraged by her example, began attending pickup basketball games in the park. Though it took time, he eventually earned back the trust of his peers, proving that second chances are possible, even for those who least deserve them. Meanwhile, the veteran continued to lead by example. He spearheaded projects to beautify the neighborhood, organized mentorship programs for local youth, and even helped launch a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in public service. Each initiative brought people closer together, strengthening the bonds that had been forged during the turmoil of the previous year. Looking back, the veteran realized the confrontation with the HOA Karen had been more than just a clash of personalities. It had been a turning point. It forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their community. Some rose to the occasion, embracing change and growth. Others stumbled but ultimately found their way forward, learning valuable lessons about humility and forgiveness. By spring, the neighborhood felt unrecognizable compared to the tense, divided place it had been before. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, birds chirped happily in the trees, and laughter echoed through the streets once more. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, they never would, but they served as reminders of how far everyone had come. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, the veteran sat on his porch, watching children chase each other across lawns and couples stroll hand in hand. Across the street, the woman waved at him from her driveway, a genuine smile lighting up her face. He returned the wave, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction settle over him.